Bill talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, visit our website or call our office. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem are taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. And we know the Senate is considering the big, beautiful bill. Where are they at with that?
Well, yeah, they're in the process of haggling it out right now. The House passed the bill. As you know, it was passed by a one-vote margin in the House of Representatives. I think it was 215 to 214. And so this massive 1,000-page bill now finds itself in the United States Senate. John Thune, who is the Senate Majority Leader, has stated that their goal is to get this thing wrapped up before the July 4th holiday. Now, whether that'll happen or not, we don't know. And the reason for the potential hang-up here is that there's a number of factions in the Senate that are fighting about whether or not they want to go ahead with this thing. I mean, it's not just a rubber stamp in the Senate. There's at least 3 or 4 factions in the Senate that are concerned about the economics of the bill and that are concerned about some of the merits of the tax elements that are in the bill itself. For example, there's a push in the Senate to adopt the so-called millionaire's tax. The millionaire's tax is a provision that would raise the top marginal tax rate from its current level of 37% back to 39.6%, which is where it was before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act took effect in 2018. Now, the difference between the tax bracket of 39.6% now and the 39.6% bracket way back in 2017 was that the current bracket would apply only to individuals earning more than $2.5 million a year or married filing jointly tax returns of more than $5 million a year. So this truly would apply to very, very high income people, income in the top 1% of the income strata. So there's no question that it would not apply to lower income people. You know, even medium to high income people are not going to have an issue with this. Now, Trump proposed this back in February of 2025 when he started to get a lot of pushback on the idea of cutting spending as part of this bill. Of course, there's not that much spending cuts in the bill, but that's a different discussion. The millionaire's tax is not in the House bill. And if the Senate puts it into its bill, then of course we're going to have a conference committee issue there. There's another faction that opposes the green energy credits that are going to be eliminated under the House version of the bill. All right, the credits for consumer credits for the purchase of electric vehicles and manufacturer credits for the production of electric vehicles. There's a host of those credits that are in the law now that were added during the Biden administration by the Inflation Reduction Act. All of those would be eliminated in the big, beautiful bill. And as I said, there's a faction in the Senate that does not want that to happen. All right, there's another faction, and it's very, very small in the Senate, that's very concerned about the spending issues, about the debt issues. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the big, beautiful bill will add about $2.4 or $2.5 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years, and it would raise the debt ceiling by another $4 trillion. So essentially, the Senate, the Congress, under this provision is writing itself a new credit card line of credit. All right, that's what raising the debt ceiling does. It's just like handing yourself a new credit card because all of your other credit cards are maxed out. That's what the debt ceiling is, that Congress has spent up to the level of congressional authorization for debt. They can't just automatically go past that level, so they need to create another line of credit. That's what increasing the debt ceiling does. There have been many, many times over the last 30, 35 years where Congress, rather than dealing with the debt problem the United States has, just simply increases the debt ceiling. And that's what the proposal is here. So there's a small faction of very conservative fiscal hawks, spending hawks in the United States Senate, led primarily by Rand Paul, who are opposed to this. And so this is the friction that's going on in the Senate right now. These folks that want to keep this or eliminate that. There's another very, very strong faction in the Senate that's concerned about the so-called Medicaid cuts. All right. Now, the Trump administration insists that there aren't any cuts, that we're really just going after Medicare fraud, and that they're adding certain work requirements to the law that would require Medicaid recipients to meet certain work requirements so as to eliminate fraud and eliminate waste and so on. You know, whether that's the case or not just obviously remains to be seen. But there is a faction of Democrats in the United States Senate that are completely convinced that we're talking about Medicaid cuts. Medicare is for senior citizens. Medicaid is health insurance and health care coverage for low-income people, right? The nation's poorest people that get health care benefits from the federal government in the form of Medicaid. Democrats are convinced that 7.7 million people will be taken off of Medicaid benefits. They will lose their benefits under this bill. The administration in the House insists that's not the case, that we're going after Medicaid fraud. And if they do go after Medicaid fraud, okay, fine. people are going to be taken off the Medicaid rolls, but they shouldn't have been on the rolls in the first place, right? If it's fraudulent. This is the friction that's going on right now.
Seems pretty unlikely that the Senate will be sticking with the House passed version of the bill. Is there any hope that we can see good things like no tax on tips revamped inside of it? Like the Senate passed that 100-0 no tax on tips bill. Is there any chance that we can see some good stuff like that make their way into the bill versus the versions that the House passed?
Well, it's interesting that you said that. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said that any bill that's presented to the president that does not include the big three things that he talked about, eliminating taxes on overtime, eliminating taxes, tip income, and eliminating taxes on Social Security, John Thune said that any bill that does not contain those provisions would be dead on arrival in the White House. And I tend to believe that. Here's what the problem is. The big, beautiful bill passed by the House has all three of those provisions in it, but they are not the kind of exclusions that the president talked about on the campaign trail, right? For example, when we're talking about tips, what the bill allows is a deduction for tips, not the complete exclusion of tips from gross income. They have to be included in gross income, but now you have a deduction that's available for those tips that would apply for anybody that's earning under $160,000. So if you're earning more than $160,000, the exclusion would not be allowed, all right? And so this is the same rule with respect to overtime. So it's a deduction for overtime pay. It's not an exclusion of overtime pay. It's a deduction for tip income, not an exclusion for tip income. And so the tips, by the way, have to be earned in a very specific service, trade, or business, and it would include businesses like law and healthcare and consulting and financial services and so on. So it's got to be a very, very narrow application.
Doesn't that feel like a bit of a bait and switch? Doesn't it feel like they kind of like he ran on this idea of exemptions and exclusions, and instead you're getting deductions and phase outs?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And this is so typical of what comes out of Congress. Candidates for office, whether we're talking about the president or any senatorial office or any congressional office, they say, we're going to do this and I'm going to do that, and you elect me and I'll do this. There's such a thing as bill scoring, all right? The Congressional Budget Office scores every bill with respect to revenue as to what it's going to collect in income if it's a tax collection bill, as to what it's going to cost in terms of benefits, if it's a giveaway program of some kind, and then also if it's a deduction or credit or exemption or exclusion. The Congressional Budget Office scores the so-called cost to that bill in terms of tax reduction, reduced revenue that the government will collect if that is enacted. So what happens in the real world is these bills start to get scored. Congressional Budget Office says, well, it's going to cost us $150 million to exclude tip income. That's light, and I'm just throwing that number out as an example. Right. It's probably more like $500 or $600 million that it would cost if we exclude tip income. And so now is when legislators start negotiating as to what they're willing to give up. So this is why you end up, big beautiful bill that passed the House, deduction for tip income and overtime pay is only limited for tax years 2025 through 2028, right? So this is not a permanent thing at all. And then, as I said, it starts phase out at $160,000. So people with that level of income aren't going to get the benefit at all, right? And so this is what happens when they start scoring these bills and senators or congressmen are unwilling to give up the money, right? We can't lose this revenue, because if they're going to ever have any hope balancing the budget, which of course I've given up on any hope of that whatsoever, but if there's going to be any hope ever of balancing the budget, they need to consider, if we're going to lose this much revenue over here, we have to cut so much spending over there in order to balance this up. Well, Josh, they're unwilling to cut the spending.
Once they get their grubby mitts on every single dollar they can, they won't let go of it.
They just will not give it up. There's no question about that. There's hard historical evidence for that. Personal income tax as we know it today, personal income tax that was created under the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913. But it wasn't until about 1942 that the average American ever had any contact with the federal income tax. And the reason for that, the income threshold was so high. For example, the very first income tax applied to people earning income of more than $25,000 a year. Well, $25,000 a year in 1913, Josh, is probably equivalent to about $300,000 or $400,000 today. So it was only the very rich that paid that income tax. And that was true really up until until 1942 when Congress passed the Victory Tax Act. The Victory Tax Act was passed as a means of funding the United States involvement in World War II, right? There was hundreds of millions of dollars that was spent on World War II, tens of billions of dollars in today's money spent on World War II, and Congress needed the money, right? They were selling bonds and they raised the income tax.
Indicative of the fact that the left will always make this claim, it's just billionaires, tax billionaires. What do you care? You're not a billionaire. Point is that they always start with taxing the people with the most money, and then they just spread it out as much as they can and creep backwards until everybody is paying the tax.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's no question about it. And what I was going to say is up until 1942, only about 10% of Americans filed a tax return and paid an income tax. And after 1942, of course, those numbers flipped around the other way. 90% were filing and paying, and maybe 10% weren't required to file and pay. But here's what happened is if you look at the revenue line for the federal government between 1900 and 1940, that revenue line is approximately flat. Now it spikes a little bit in 1930 through 1940 because of the spending that the federal government did on Depression era programs, but it really spiked significantly in 1941, 1942 really, when America got involved in World War II. That's when the spending spiked considerably. That's when the revenue to the federal government spiked considerably. And if you look at that chart, you will see that at no time after 1943-44 did the revenue of the federal government ever go down. In other words, once they got their hands on that money, they never let it go, ever. And so what happens, and we see this now, congressional session after session after session, they create some other kind of war that they have to fight. The war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on terrorism. Go down the list of all these wars that the federal government declares so that they can spend billions and billions into trillions and trillions of dollars and never allow the earners of America to keep the money they earn.
All right, that's all for this week. Thanks for watching, taxpayers. Remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. And if you think yours is the exception, then call our office or visit our website to get a hold of Dan here, and he can help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
I'm at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, Truth Social, and right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share these videos, especially with your federal and state representatives in Congress and in state houses. And if you have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. Buy any book off my website at any price point, and you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me.